The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as thousands of people gathered for what would become one of the most memorable changing of the guard ceremonies in recent history. Among the crowd stood Marcus Thompson, a 24-year-old Marine from Texas who had traveled across the Atlantic not as a tourist, but as a young man carrying the weight of an impossible promise. Marcus had never imagined he would find himself in London, much less standing before the gates of Buckingham Palace. Just 6 months earlier, he had been deployed in Afghanistan, serving his third tour of duty with the United States Marine Corps. His best friend and fellow Marine, David Chen, had been by his side through every dangerous mission, every sleepless night, and every moment of homesickness that comes with being so far from everything familiar. David had grown up in a military family, but unlike Marcus, who joined the Marines straight out of high school looking for direction, David had always dreamed of seeing the world. He carried with him a worn notebook filled with places he wanted to visit, experiences he wanted to have, and people he wanted to meet. At the top of his list was witnessing the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. David had read every book he could find about British military traditions, and he would often tell Marcus stories about the Queen's Guard, their unwavering discipline, and the centuries of history they represented. The two Marines had made a pact during their deployment. When their service ended, they would travel together to all the places in David's notebook. They would start with London, David insisted, because he wanted to see if the Queen's Guard were really as disciplined and professional as the stories claimed. Marcus had laughed at his friend's fascination, but he had promised nonetheless. A Marine's word was his bond, and David was more than a fellow soldier to Marcus. He was the brother Marcus had never had. The promise became infinitely more precious and painful on a dusty Tuesday morning in Helmand Province. David's unit had been returning from a routine patrol when their convoy hit an improvised explosive device. Marcus was in the vehicle behind and watched in horror as his best friend's truck disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris. By the time the dust settled and the medics reached the scene, David Chen was gone, taking with him all the dreams in his worn notebook, and leaving Marcus with the crushing weight of a promise he never imagined he would have to keep alone. The months that followed blurred together in a haze of grief, guilt, and the mechanical completion of duties. Marcus finished his deployment, returned to the States, and tried to resume some semblance of normal life. But normal no longer existed. Every sunset reminded him of conversations with David about places they would never see together. Every laugh felt like a betrayal of his friend's memory. The notebook, which David's family had given to Marcus, along with his other personal effects, sat unopened on his dresser for weeks. It was Marcus's mother who finally convinced him to open it. She had never met David, but she had heard enough stories to know what the friendship meant to her son. She found Marcus sitting in his childhood bedroom one evening, staring at nothing, and she sat beside him with the gentle persistence that only mothers possess. Together, they opened David's notebook and read through page after page of dreams written in careful handwriting. London was indeed at the top of the list, with detailed notes about the history of the Queen's Guard, the significance of their role, and David's particular fascination with their ability to maintain perfect composure regardless of what was happening around them. Marcus's decision to honor David's wishes was not immediate. It took another month of sleepless nights and difficult conversations with military counselors before he finally bought a ticket to London. He told himself he was going for closure, but deep down, he knew he was going because he could not bear the thought of David's dreams dying with him. If Marcus could not bring his friend back, he could at least carry a piece of him to the places he had longed to see. The flight to London was the longest 8 hours of Marcus's life. He sat clutching David's notebook, reading and rereading the entries about British military traditions. David had written extensively about the Queen's Guard, noting their origins in the 17th century, their role in protecting the monarchy, and the rigorous training required to join their ranks. What struck Marcus most was David's genuine admiration for their discipline and dedication. David had seen it as a different expression of the same values that had drawn them both to military service: honor, duty, and an unwavering commitment to something greater than themselves. London overwhelmed Marcus from the moment he stepped off the plane. The city was everything David had described and more: ancient and modern existing side by side, history visible on every corner, and a sense of ceremony and tradition that permeated daily life. Marcus spent his first day walking aimlessly through the streets, trying to see the city through David's eyes, trying to understand what had captured his friend's imagination so completely. He found himself standing before Buckingham Palace on his second day, notebook in hand, reading David's notes about the optimal viewing positions for the changing of the guard ceremony. The crowds were already beginning to gather, even though the ceremony was still hours away. Families with children, elderly couples who had clearly seen the ceremony many times before, and tourists from every corner of the world all pressed against the gates, cameras ready, excitement building. Marcus felt out of place among the cheerful tourists. He was not there to capture the perfect photograph or to check an item off a bucket list. He was there to fulfill a promise to a dead friend, to somehow bridge the gap between David's dreams and the reality that David would never experience. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him as he found a spot near the front of the crowd and settled in to wait. As the morning wore on, Marcus found himself studying the guards already stationed at their posts. They stood with perfect posture, their red tunics immaculate, their tall black bearskin hats casting shadows over their faces. They appeared completely oblivious to the growing crowd, the increasing noise, and the countless cameras pointed in their direction. Marcus thought about David's admiration for their discipline and began to understand what his friend had seen in them. Here were soldiers who had mastered the art of duty without glory, service without recognition, and professionalism without compromise. The crowd continued to grow throughout the morning, pressing closer to the gates, voices rising in anticipation. Children were lifted onto shoulders for better views, elderly visitors claimed the best spots with the authority of experience, and tour guides shared historical facts in a dozen different languages. The atmosphere was festive, almost carnival-like, and Marcus found himself smiling despite his heavy heart. David would have loved this energy, this international celebration of military tradition. As 11 o'clock approached, the anticipation in the crowd became palpable. Conversations quieted to whispers, cameras were raised and ready, and everyone pressed forward for the best possible view. Marcus checked his watch, then looked down at David's notebook one more time. His friend had written detailed notes about what to expect. The arrival of the new guard, the inspection of the troops, the exchange of symbolic keys, and the precise movements that had been performed the same way for generations. The first sounds of the approaching ceremony could be heard in the distance, the rhythmic march of boots on pavement and the faint notes of military music. The crowd stirred with excitement, and Marcus felt his own pulse quicken. This was it. This was the moment David had dreamed of witnessing, and Marcus was here to experience it for both of them. The guards appeared first, their red tunics brilliant in the morning sun, their movements synchronized with military precision. They marched in perfect formation, faces impassive, eyes focused straight ahead. Behind them came the military band, their instruments gleaming, their music filling the air with centuries-old melodies that seemed to echo off the palace walls and into the hearts of everyone present. Marcus watched in fascination as the ceremony unfolded exactly as David had described in his notebook. The inspection was meticulous, the exchange of duties was performed with ceremonial gravity, and throughout it all, the guards maintained the perfect composure that had so impressed David from afar. Marcus found himself thinking not just about his friend's admiration for their discipline, but about the similarities between these guards and the Marines he had served with. Different uniforms, different traditions, but the same fundamental commitment to duty and excellence. As the ceremony continued, Marcus noticed something that David's research had not fully captured, the human element that existed beneath the pageantry. While the guards maintained their stoic expressions and perfect posture, Marcus could see the subtle signs of the real people underneath the uniforms. A slight adjustment of weight from one foot to the other during the long periods of standing. A barely perceptible blink when a camera flash went off directly in their faces. The way their breathing became slightly more visible in the cool morning air as the ceremony progressed. These small observations made Marcus think about his own military service, and the countless times he and David had been required to maintain composure in difficult circumstances. Whether standing at attention during inspections, maintaining focus during long patrol missions, or simply projecting confidence when they felt anything but confident inside, military service required a constant balancing act between human vulnerability and professional strength. The crowd around Marcus was completely absorbed in the spectacle, but he found his attention drawn to one guard in particular. The young man could not have been much older than Marcus himself, and something about his bearing reminded Marcus of David. Perhaps it was the way he held his rifle, or the slight tilt of his head, or simply the aura of quiet competence that David had always projected. Whatever it was, Marcus felt a connection that surprised him with its intensity. As the ceremony reached its climax, with the old guard preparing to march away and the new guard taking their positions, Marcus made a decision that would change the course of his day and create a moment that neither he nor anyone else present would ever forget. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something he had carried with him from Afghanistan, David's military dog tags, which had been returned to Marcus along with his friend's other personal effects. Marcus had not planned to do anything dramatic or attention-seeking. He simply felt that David should somehow be present for this moment he had dreamed of witnessing. Standing at the front of the crowd, Marcus held the dog tags up slightly, not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet acknowledgement of his friend's presence in spirit. The tags caught the sunlight and glinted briefly, drawing the attention of the guard Marcus had been watching. What happened next would be discussed and analyzed by military historians, royal protocol experts, and anyone who witnessed it for years to come. The young guard, whose name was James Morrison, noticed the glint of metal and looked directly at Marcus. In that instant, James saw not just another tourist, but something in Marcus's bearing and expression that he recognized immediately. The way Marcus stood, the respect in his posture, the unmistakable bearing of a fellow soldier. James had been serving with the Queen's Guard for 2 years, and in that time he had mastered the art of maintaining perfect composure regardless of what was happening around him. He had stood motionless while tourists tried to make him laugh, children attempted to get his attention, and protesters shouted mere feet away. His training had prepared him for every conceivable distraction and disruption. But his training had not prepared him for the sight of a fellow soldier, paying silent tribute to a fallen comrade. The dog tags in Marcus's hand were clearly military issue, and James could see the respect and solemnity with which Marcus held them. Without understanding the full story, James recognized the moment for what it was. One warrior honoring another, one soldier acknowledging the sacrifice of a brother in arms. In that recognition, something shifted in James's perfectly controlled expression. The change was subtle at first, visible only to those standing closest to the gates. James's eyes, which had been staring straight ahead with military precision, moved slightly to make direct eye contact with Marcus. It was a small deviation from protocol, but significant enough to be noticed by several people in the crowd who were familiar with the strict rules governing the Queen's Guard. Marcus felt the eye contact like an electric shock. Here was a complete stranger, a soldier from a different country and military tradition, acknowledging his tribute to David with a kind of respect that transcended national boundaries. In that moment, Marcus understood what David had seen in the Queen's Guard that went beyond their ceremonial role. They were soldiers first, and soldiers recognized other soldiers regardless of the uniform they wore. The moment stretched between them, 2 young men from different worlds connected by their shared understanding of military service, duty, and loss. James maintained his perfect posture and continued to perform his ceremonial duties, but his eyes remained fixed on Marcus and the dog tags that glinted in the morning sun. The crowd around them continued to watch the ceremony, unaware that they were witnessing something far more profound than the changing of the guard. Marcus felt tears beginning to form in his eyes, and for the first time since David's death, they were not tears of pure grief. They were tears of recognition, of gratitude, and of the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that a promise has been kept in the most meaningful way possible. David's dream of witnessing the changing of the guard was being fulfilled, not just through Marcus's presence, but through this moment of connection between soldiers that David himself could never have imagined. As the ceremony continued around them, Marcus and James remained locked in their silent communication. James had found a way to honor Marcus's tribute without breaking protocol, and Marcus had found something he had not expected to find. A sense that David's death, while tragic and senseless, was part of a larger story of service and sacrifice that connected soldiers across time and geography. The other guards continued their duties with perfect precision, the band continued to play, and the crowd continued to photograph and applaud. But at the center of it all, 2 young men stood connected by something that needed no words, no formal introduction, and no explanation beyond the simple recognition of shared commitment to something greater than themselves. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting new shadows across the palace courtyard, and illuminating what had begun as a simple tourist attraction, but had somehow transformed into something approaching the sacred. Marcus held David's dog tags a little higher, and James's eyes never wavered from the quiet tribute being paid to a fallen Marine by his surviving brother in arms. The silent exchange between Marcus and James continued as the changing of the guard ceremony progressed around them, but it was beginning to attract attention from others in the crowd. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a 73-year-old London resident who had been attending the ceremony regularly for over 40 years, was the first to notice that something unusual was happening. She had positioned herself, as always, in the same spot near the central gates where she had the best view of the proceedings, and her experienced eye immediately caught the subtle deviation in the guard's behavior. Eleanor had seen thousands of these ceremonies over the decades. She had witnessed protests, marriage proposals, celebrity visits, and every conceivable attempt to break the legendary composure of the Queen's Guard. She knew exactly how the guards were supposed to behave, and she could tell that James Morrison was doing something he had never done before. His eyes, which should have been staring straight ahead or following the prescribed ceremonial movements, were fixed on a young man in the crowd with an intensity that spoke of genuine human connection rather than mere professional duty. Following James's gaze, Eleanor noticed Marcus standing at the front of the crowd, holding what appeared to be military identification tags. Even from her position several feet away, she could see the solemnity in Marcus's posture and the tears beginning to form in his eyes. Eleanor had lived through World War II as a child, had lost her own brother in Korea, and had spent a lifetime around military families. She recognized immediately what she was witnessing, a soldier honoring a fallen comrade. The realization hit Eleanor with unexpected force. This was not a tourist trying to get a reaction from the guard for a photograph or a video. This was something sacred, a moment of military brotherhood that transcended national boundaries and formal protocols. Eleanor found herself holding her breath, afraid that any movement or sound might break the spell that had settled over this small section of the crowd. As word began to spread quietly through the immediate area, other spectators started to take notice of the unusual interaction. Sarah Mitchell, a young mother from Manchester who had brought her 8-year-old son Tommy to see his first changing of the guard ceremony, found herself explaining in whispered tones what she thought was happening. Tommy, who had been fidgeting and asking constant questions throughout the morning, suddenly became still and attentive, sensing that something important was occurring even if he did not fully understand what it was. Behind them, Dr. Robert Singh, a military historian from Oxford University who attended the ceremony monthly as part of his research into British military traditions, began to document what he was witnessing with the careful attention of a scholar who recognized he was observing something unprecedented. Dr. Singh had written extensively about the protocols governing the Queen's Guard and the strict rules that prevented them from acknowledging individual members of the public. What he was seeing challenged everything he thought he knew about those protocols, and he found himself questioning whether this was a breach of discipline or something else entirely. The ceremony continued with its usual precision, but James Morrison had found himself in uncharted territory. His training had been exhaustive and had covered every conceivable scenario he might encounter while on duty. He had been taught how to respond to physical threats, how to ignore taunts and provocations, how to maintain composure during medical emergencies, and how to continue his duties regardless of weather, crowd behavior, or personal discomfort. But no training manual had prepared him for the sight of a fellow soldier paying tribute to a fallen comrade. James had joined the Queen's Guard after serving 2 tours with the British Army in Afghanistan, and he understood exactly what Marcus was doing and why it mattered. The dog tags in Marcus's hand told a story that needed no words. Somewhere, a soldier had died in service to his country, and his friend had traveled thousands of miles to honor his memory in a place that had meant something to him. The fact that this was happening during the changing of the guard ceremony, a ritual steeped in military tradition and honor, made the moment even more significant. The internal conflict James faced was intense. His duty as a member of the Queen's Guard required absolute adherence to protocol, which meant maintaining perfect composure and avoiding any acknowledgement of individual members of the public. But his identity as a soldier, as someone who had lost friends in combat and understood the weight of survivors' guilt, demanded that he somehow acknowledge Marcus's tribute. The question was how to honor both obligations without compromising either. The answer came to James in a moment of inspiration that would later be analyzed by military protocol experts and praised by veterans organizations around the world. Without moving his head or changing his basic stance, James began to shift his weight in a specific pattern. 3 quick shifts to the left, 3 to the right, and then back to center. To casual observers, it might have looked like a normal adjustment to maintain circulation during a long period of standing. But to anyone with military training, the pattern was unmistakable. It was a simplified version of the rifle salute cadence used by honor guards at military funerals. Marcus recognized the pattern immediately and felt his knees nearly buckle with emotion. This stranger, this British soldier he had never met and would never see again, was using the only means available to him to return Marcus's salute and honor David's memory. The gesture was so subtle that most of the crowd missed it entirely, but for those who understood its significance, it was as powerful as any formal ceremony. Eleanor Hartwell was among those who recognized what James had done, and she found herself wiping away tears she had not expected to shed. She had attended these ceremonies for decades as a form of entertainment, a pleasant way to spend a morning and connect with British traditions. But this ceremony had become something entirely different, a reminder of why those traditions mattered and what they represented. The pomp and circumstance were not mere spectacle. They were expressions of values that connected soldiers across time and geography. Dr. Singh was frantically scribbling notes, trying to capture every detail of what he was witnessing. As a scholar, he understood that he was observing a moment that would likely never be repeated and might not be believed by those who had not seen it themselves. The idea that a member of the Queen's Guard would devise an impromptu way to acknowledge a foreign soldier's tribute while maintaining the letter, if not the spirit, of his protocols was both remarkable and deeply moving. Sarah Mitchell found herself explaining to her son Tommy what was happening in terms he could understand. She told him about soldiers who protected their countries and sometimes died doing so, about friends who promised to remember them, and about how sometimes people found ways to show respect that did not require words. Tommy listened with the serious attention that children reserve for truly important things, and when he asked if the guard and the American soldier were friends now, Sarah found herself saying yes without hesitation. The moment stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Marcus continued to hold David's dog tags, and James continued his subtle acknowledgement, while around them the formal ceremony proceeded with its usual grandeur. The juxtaposition was striking, ancient traditions and spontaneous human connection existing simultaneously, neither diminishing the other, both enriched by the contrast. Other members of the Queen's Guard had begun to notice what was happening, though their own training prevented them from breaking character to investigate. Sergeant William Davies, a 20-year veteran who was supervising the ceremony, had positioned himself where he could observe all of his men while remaining outside the direct view of the crowd. He had noticed James's deviation from standard posture and was initially prepared to address it as a discipline issue. But as he followed James's line of sight and understood what was happening, Sergeant Davies found himself facing the same conflict between protocol and humanity that James was navigating. Sergeant Davies had served in Iraq and Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard, and he had attended too many military funerals to count. He knew the look of a man honoring a fallen comrade, and he understood the significance of what Marcus was doing. More importantly, he recognized the wisdom of James's response. The young guard had found a way to honor his fellow soldier while maintaining the dignity and discipline required of his position. It was, Sergeant Davies realized, exactly what a good soldier should do when faced with an impossible situation. The decision Sergeant Davies made in that moment would later be reviewed by his superiors, discussed in military academies, and held up as an example of leadership in complex situations. Rather than intervene to enforce strict protocol, he chose to trust his soldiers' judgment and allow the moment to continue. He positioned himself to block the view of any superior officers who might not understand the nuance of the situation, and settled in to witness what he suspected would be a career-defining moment for everyone involved. As the ceremony moved toward its conclusion, the crowd began to sense that something extraordinary was happening. Conversations quieted, cameras were lowered, and attention focused on the silent drama playing out between Marcus and James. Even those who did not understand the military significance of what they were witnessing could feel the emotion and gravity of the moment. Maria Gonzalez, a tourist from Spain who spoke very little English, found herself crying without fully understanding why. She had come to London to see the famous ceremonies and take photographs to share with her family back home, but she was witnessing something that transcended language and cultural barriers. The respect and solemnity she observed in both the American and the British soldier spoke to something universal about honor, loss, and the bonds between those who serve. A group of American tourists who had been laughing and taking selfies moments earlier fell silent as they recognized Marcus's accent during a brief moment when he whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Jennifer and Mark Patterson from California realized they were witnessing a fellow American honoring a fallen soldier, and they found themselves standing straighter, their own hands moving unconsciously to their hearts as they watched Marcus hold David's dog tags toward the guard who was acknowledging their significance. The moment was being captured on dozens of cameras and cell phones, but the photographers seemed to understand instinctively that this was not a spectacle to be exploited. Instead of jockeying for better angles or trying to get closer, the crowd maintained a respectful distance, documenting what they were seeing with the reverence typically reserved for sacred ceremonies. Many would later say that they felt privileged to witness something so genuine and meaningful amid the tourist attractions and planned entertainment of London. As the formal ceremony reached its climax, James faced another protocol challenge. The changing of the guard required specific movements and positioning as the old guard was relieved and the new guard took their posts. James needed to maintain his acknowledgement of Marcus while performing his ceremonial duties, a coordination that required both physical skill and emotional control. The solution James found was to incorporate Marcus into his performance of the ceremony itself. As he moved through the prescribed positions and responses, James ensured that each movement brought him back to a position where he could maintain eye contact with Marcus. When he presented arms, he directed his salute slightly toward Marcus rather than straight ahead. When he performed the ritual inspection of his equipment, he held his rifle in a position that created a direct line between himself and the American Marine holding his friend's dog tags. These modifications were so subtle that they would have been invisible to anyone not specifically watching for them. But they created a continuous thread of connection between the two soldiers that lasted throughout the remainder of the ceremony. Marcus understood what James was doing and found himself unconsciously moving through a simplified version of military bearing himself, standing straighter, holding David's tags with the precision of a formal presentation, and maintaining the kind of focused attention that characterized military ceremonies. The transformation in both men was visible to those watching closely. What had begun as a tourist paying his respects had evolved into something approaching a formal military tribute, with Marcus and James creating their own ceremony within the larger spectacle. The crowd around them had become witnesses to an improvised ritual that honored both British military tradition and American military sacrifice while requiring no official sanction or formal recognition. As the old guard began to march away and the new guard settled into their positions, the moment of acute connection between Marcus and James began to shift toward its conclusion. Both men understood that the ceremony was ending and that James would soon be required to assume his regular duty position, which would not allow for the kind of acknowledgement he had been providing. The knowledge that their interaction was drawing to a close intensified the emotion both men were feeling and added urgency to their silent communication. Marcus found himself wanting to say something, to somehow express his gratitude for James's recognition and respect. But he also understood that speaking would break the spell that had made this interaction possible and might cause problems for the guard who had risked his own standing to honor David's memory. Instead, Marcus simply mouthed the words, "Thank you," while holding David's dog tags up one final time in a gesture that combined tribute to his fallen friend with appreciation for the stranger who had helped him honor that friendship. James received Marcus's thanks with a barely perceptible nod that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and his own sense of privilege at being included in such a personal moment. As he settled into his final position for his tour of duty, James allowed himself one last direct look at Marcus, imprinting the moment in his memory as something that would remind him for the rest of his career why military service mattered and what it meant to truly honor those who had given their lives for their countries. The formal ceremony concluded with the traditional fanfare and precision that had characterized British military ceremonies for centuries. But for everyone who had witnessed the interaction between Marcus and James, the conclusion felt secondary to what they had observed between the two soldiers. As the crowd began to disperse and normal tourist activities resumed around Buckingham Palace, A small group of people remained near the gates, reluctant to leave the site where they had witnessed something that had touched them more deeply than any planned entertainment ever could. Marcus stood alone for several minutes after the ceremony ended, still holding David's dog tags and looking at the spot where James had stood. The promise he had made to his fallen friend had been fulfilled in a way that exceeded anything he could have imagined when he first opened David's notebook and read about his dream of witnessing the changing of the guard. David had wanted to see the ceremony because he admired the discipline and professionalism of the Queen's Guard, but what Marcus had experienced was something far more profound. Proof that the values David had admired were real, and that they created connections between soldiers that transcended nationality, protocol, and circumstance. The weight Marcus had carried since David's death had not disappeared, but it had changed. The grief was still there, and the sense of loss remained as sharp as ever, but now it was accompanied by something else. A deep satisfaction that came from knowing he had honored his friend in the most meaningful way possible, and that David's respect for military tradition had been validated by the actions of a guard who had never met him but had understood immediately what his sacrifice meant. The aftermath of the ceremony left Marcus standing alone in front of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by dispersing tourists, but feeling more connected to David's memory than he had since his friend's death. As the crowd thinned and normal London life resumed around him, Marcus became aware that several people were lingering nearby, seemingly reluctant to leave the scene of what they had witnessed. Their presence was not intrusive, but rather felt like the natural response of people who had been touched by something significant and needed time to process what they had experienced. Eleanor Hartwell was the first to approach Marcus, her decades of London politeness overridden by her instinct to reach out to someone who had clearly been through something profound. She had watched the entire interaction between Marcus and James with growing emotion, and she felt compelled to acknowledge what she had witnessed. As she walked toward Marcus, she noticed that his hands were shaking slightly as he carefully placed David's dog tags back in his pocket, a detail that reminded her of her own brother's return from Korea and the way trauma could manifest in unexpected moments. Eleanor introduced herself with the gentle formality that characterized her generation, explaining that she had been attending the changing of the guard ceremony for over 40 years and had never seen anything like what had just occurred. Her voice carried the weight of lived experience as she told Marcus that she understood he was honoring a fallen friend, and that what the guard had done to acknowledge that honor was something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Eleanor's words were simple and direct, but they carried the authority of someone who had witnessed history and understood its significance. Marcus found himself grateful for Eleanor's approach and her willingness to acknowledge what had happened. He had been uncertain whether anyone else had noticed the interaction between himself and James, and Eleanor's confirmation that others had seen and understood its significance made the experience feel more real and less like something he might have imagined in his grief. When Eleanor asked about his friend, Marcus found himself able to speak about David for the first time since the funeral, describing his friend's fascination with military traditions and his specific desire to witness the changing of the guard. As Marcus and Eleanor talked, Dr. Robert Singh approached with the respectful caution of an academic who recognized he was in the presence of something that transcended his scholarly interests. Dr. Singh introduced himself and explained his research into British military traditions, but he was careful to emphasize that his interest in what had occurred was not purely academic. As someone who had studied military protocols for decades, he understood the significance of what James had done, and the risk the young guard had taken in deviating from standard procedures to honor Marcus's tribute. Dr. Singh's perspective added another layer to Marcus's understanding of what had occurred. The historian explained that the Queen's Guard protocols had been developed over centuries and were designed to ensure that personal emotions never interfered with official duties. The fact that James had found a way to acknowledge Marcus's tribute while maintaining the essential dignity and discipline of his position demonstrated a level of military judgment and human understanding that Dr. Singh described as extraordinary. The scholar's analysis helped Marcus appreciate not just the emotional significance of what had happened, but also its technical and professional dimensions. Sarah Mitchell and her son Tommy had remained nearby throughout these conversations, and when there was a natural pause, Sarah approached to thank Marcus for what he had done. She explained that she had brought Tommy to see the ceremony as a way of teaching him about British traditions and history, but that what they had witnessed had become a lesson about much more than ceremonial pageantry. Tommy, with the directness of childhood, asked Marcus if his friend had been brave, and when Marcus confirmed that David had been very brave indeed, Tommy announced that he thought the guard had been brave too for recognizing David even though it was not part of his job. The simple wisdom of Tommy's observation struck everyone present with unexpected force. The 8-year-old had somehow captured the essential truth of what they had witnessed, that James's actions had required a different kind of courage than what was normally associated with military service. It was the courage to choose humanity over regulation, connection over protocol, and personal risk over professional safety. The fact that a child could see this so clearly while adults struggled to articulate it reminded everyone present of the fundamental human values that military service was supposed to protect. As more people joined the informal gathering around Marcus, the conversation began to take on the characteristics of an impromptu memorial service. Maria Gonzalez, the Spanish tourist who had been moved to tears during the ceremony, approached with her phrase book and attempted to express her condolences in halting English. The language barrier did not diminish the sincerity of her sympathy, and Marcus found himself touched by her effort to connect across cultural and linguistic differences. Her presence reminded everyone that what they had witnessed transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. The American tourists, Jennifer and Mark Patterson from California, shared their own military connections when they approached Marcus. Mark's father had served in Vietnam, and Jennifer's brother was currently deployed with the Navy. They understood the significance of Marcus's journey to London and the importance of keeping promises to fallen comrades. Their presence created a sense of extended military family that helped Marcus feel less alone in a foreign country, and reminded everyone present that military service created bonds that extended far beyond national boundaries. As the impromptu gathering continued, Marcus found himself sharing more details about David and their friendship. He described David's fascination with military history, his collection of books about military traditions from around the world, and his specific admiration for the Queen's Guard. Marcus explained that David had seen the Guard as representing the highest ideals of military service: duty performed with dignity, service rendered without recognition, and commitment maintained regardless of personal cost. The ceremony David had dreamed of witnessing had indeed embodied those ideals, but in ways that David could never have imagined. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Sergeant William Davies, who had finished his supervisory duties and decided to seek out Marcus. The sergeant's appearance created a moment of tension, as everyone present understood that Marcus's interaction with James might have violated official protocols, and that Davies might be there to address the situation as a disciplinary matter. However, Davies' demeanor immediately indicated that his intentions were far from punitive. Sergeant Davies introduced himself and explained that he had observed the entire interaction between Marcus and James. Rather than expressing concern about protocol violations, Davies praised both soldiers for their handling of an unprecedented situation. He told Marcus that James's response had been exactly what he would have hoped for from one of his men when faced with such a situation, and he commended Marcus for the dignity and respect with which he had honored his fallen friend. Davies' words carried the authority of someone who had served in combat and understood the bonds between soldiers that transcended formal regulations. The sergeant's endorsement of what had occurred transformed the mood of the gathering from one of uncertain admiration to one of confident celebration. If the military authority who had supervised the ceremony approved of what had happened, then everyone present could feel comfortable in their assessment that they had witnessed something remarkable rather than problematic. Davies' presence also provided an opportunity for people to ask questions about military protocols and traditions, turning the informal gathering into an educational experience that helped everyone better understand what they had observed. During these conversations, Davies shared his own perspective on what James had done and why it mattered. He explained that military service required a constant balance between following orders and making independent judgments, between maintaining discipline and responding to human needs. The best soldiers, Davies observed, were those who could maintain that balance even in unexpected situations, and James's response to Marcus's tribute demonstrated exactly that kind of military judgment. The sergeant's analysis helped everyone present understand that what they had witnessed was not a breach of discipline, but rather an example of discipline at its highest level. As the afternoon progressed, the gathering around Marcus began to take on a more formal character. Eleanor Hartwell, with her decades of experience organizing community events, began coordinating the group to ensure that everyone who wanted to share their thoughts had an opportunity to do so. Dr. Singh took notes on the conversations, with Marcus's permission, explaining that he wanted to document what had occurred for his research into military traditions and their contemporary relevance. Sarah Mitchell helped translate for Maria Gonzalez, ensuring that language barriers did not prevent anyone from participating fully in the discussion. The impromptu memorial service that had developed around Marcus became a powerful example of how shared experiences can create temporary communities among strangers. People who had arrived at Buckingham Palace as individual tourists found themselves part of a group united by their witness to something extraordinary. The conversations revealed the diverse ways in which people connected with military service and sacrifice. Through family members who had served, through personal military experience, through historical interest, or simply through human empathy for those who had lost friends in service to their countries. During one particularly moving moment, Eleanor Hartwell asked Marcus if he would be willing to share some specific memories of David, explaining that she felt the group had become invested in honoring his friend's memory and would like to know more about the person they were commemorating. Marcus found himself able to talk about David with an ease that surprised him, describing his friend's sense of humor, his dedication to his fellow Marines, his dreams for the future, and his genuine excitement about experiencing different cultures and military traditions around the world. Marcus's stories about David painted a picture of a young man who had joined the military not just to serve his country, but to understand the world and his place in it. David's notebook, which Marcus still carried, contained not just lists of places to visit, but thoughtful observations about different military traditions and their cultural significance. David had seen military service as a way to connect with something larger than himself, and his fascination with the Queen's Guard reflected his belief that military traditions created bridges between cultures and generations. The conversation was enriched by the diverse perspectives of the group that had formed around Marcus. Dr. Singh provided historical context for David's observations about military traditions, explaining how ceremonies like the changing of the guard served both practical and symbolic functions. Eleanor Hartwell shared stories from her own experience of military ceremonies during and after World War II, helping everyone understand how such rituals had provided comfort and continuity during times of national crisis. Sergeant Davies explained how contemporary military training sought to balance respect for tradition with adaptation to modern realities. As the afternoon wore on, the group began to discuss ways to ensure that what had occurred would be remembered and honored appropriately. Dr. Singh suggested documenting the event for military history archives, while Eleanor proposed creating some kind of memorial tribute that could be shared with David's family. Sarah Mitchell offered to help coordinate any efforts to reach out to James Morrison to thank him for his actions, and the American tourists volunteered to help spread the story through veterans' organizations back in the United States. Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the generosity and thoughtfulness of these strangers who had become invested in honoring his friend's memory. What had begun as a solitary journey to fulfill a promise to a dead friend had somehow become a collaborative effort involving people from multiple countries and backgrounds, all united by their recognition of the significance of what they had witnessed. The transformation reminded Marcus that David's values of service and connection had not died with him, but continued to inspire others who had never met him. The discussions about memorializing the event led to practical questions about how to contact James Morrison and whether he would be able to participate in any follow-up activities. Sergeant Davies explained that while he could not provide direct contact information, he would be willing to serve as an intermediary to convey messages to James and to inform him of the impact his actions had on those who witnessed them. The sergeant also mentioned that the story would likely need to be reported through military channels, but that he expected James's actions to be viewed favorably by his superiors. As the group continued to develop plans for honoring both David's memory and James's recognition of it, Marcus realized that his journey to London had accomplished far more than simply fulfilling a promise to a dead friend. David's dream of witnessing the changing of the guard had been fulfilled, but more importantly, David's values of service, respect, and human connection had been validated and extended through the actions of people who had never met him. The ceremony that David had wanted to see had indeed demonstrated the military ideals he admired, but it had also created new connections and new commitments among people who might otherwise never have encountered each other. The transformation of Marcus's private act of remembrance into a public celebration of military values and human connection reflected something that David himself might have appreciated: the way individual acts of service and sacrifice could inspire others to extend those same values in their own lives. The notebook that had brought Marcus to London had been David's private collection of dreams and observations, but the events that had unfolded at Buckingham Palace had turned those private dreams into shared experiences that would be remembered and retold by everyone present. As evening approached and the group began to consider dispersing, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion that went beyond simply fulfilling his promise to David. The journey to London had begun as an act of grief and obligation, but it had become something approaching celebration and renewal. David's death remained a tragedy that nothing could undo, but the response to Marcus's tribute had demonstrated that David's life and values continued to have meaning and influence beyond his physical presence. The ceremony at Buckingham Palace had shown that military traditions were not empty rituals, but living expressions of values that could still inspire connection and respect among people from different countries and backgrounds. The days following the ceremony at Buckingham Palace brought unexpected developments that none of the participants could have anticipated. Word of the interaction between Marcus and James began to spread through both official and unofficial channels, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate witnesses to the event. The story took on a life of its own as it moved through social media, military networks, veterans organizations, and news outlets, each retelling adding new layers of meaning and significance to what had occurred. The first indication that the story was reaching a wider audience came through Dr. Robert Singh's academic connections. The historian had contacted colleagues at military academies and universities around the world to share his observations about the event, and their responses indicated that the story was being received as something far more significant than a simple human interest piece. Military ethicists were discussing the balance between protocol and humanity that James had achieved, while scholars of international relations were analyzing the diplomatic implications of the cross-cultural military recognition that had occurred. Eleanor Hartwell had taken it upon herself to contact various veterans organizations in London, sharing the story with groups that she felt would appreciate its significance. Her outreach had connected with the Royal British Legion, Help for Heroes, and several other organizations that supported current and former military personnel. These groups were particularly interested in the story because it demonstrated the international nature of military brotherhood and the ways in which acts of recognition could provide healing for those dealing with loss and trauma. Sarah Mitchell had shared the story through her social media networks, and her post had been shared and reshared by hundreds of people, each adding their own commentary about military service, loss, and respect. The viral nature of the story was bringing it to the attention of people who had no direct military connections, but who were moved by the human elements of the encounter. Comments on social media posts revealed that the story was resonating with people who had lost family members, who had struggled with keeping promises to deceased loved ones, and who were simply inspired by examples of strangers showing unexpected kindness and respect. Marcus found himself at the center of this growing attention, but rather than feeling overwhelmed, he discovered that sharing David's story was providing him with a sense of purpose he had not experienced since his friend's death. Each person who contacted him to express their appreciation for what had occurred was, in effect, honoring David's memory, and Marcus began to understand that his journey to London had created opportunities for David's life and values to touch people who had never met him. The most significant development came through Sergeant William Davies, who had reported the incident through military channels and had received instructions to facilitate contact between Marcus and James Morrison. The British military's response to the story had been overwhelmingly positive, with senior officers praising James's handling of the situation and expressing interest in using the incident as a case study in military ethics and cross-cultural cooperation. Rather than facing disciplinary action, James was being recognized for his demonstration of military values at their highest level. The arranged meeting between Marcus and James took place at a quiet pub near Wellington Barracks, away from the tourist areas and media attention that had begun to surround their story. Sergeant Davies served as the facilitator, ensuring that both men felt comfortable and that their conversation could proceed without external pressure or interference. The meeting represented the first time Marcus and James had been able to speak directly about what had occurred during the ceremony and what it had meant to each of them. James Morrison proved to be exactly what Marcus had hoped, a thoughtful, articulate young man who understood the significance of military service and the bonds between soldiers. James explained that his response during the ceremony had been instinctive rather than calculated, driven by his recognition of what Marcus was doing and his desire to honor both Marcus's tribute and the memory of his fallen friend. James had served in Afghanistan and had lost friends of his own, so he understood both the weight of survivors' guilt and the importance of keeping promises to the dead. The conversation between Marcus and James revealed the depth of thought that had gone into James's actions during the ceremony. Far from being a simple emotional response, James's recognition of Marcus had been the result of rapid but careful consideration of how to honor the moment while maintaining the dignity required of his position. James explained that he had drawn on his combat experience, where soldiers frequently had to make quick decisions that balanced competing priorities, to find a solution that respected both military protocol and human decency. Marcus was able to share more details about David and their friendship, giving James a fuller picture of the person whose memory he had helped honor. The description of David's fascination with military traditions and his specific admiration for the Queen's Guard moved James deeply, as it validated his own commitment to the role and its significance. James had sometimes wondered whether the ceremonial aspects of his duties were as meaningful as his combat service had been. But David's appreciation for military traditions helped him understand that ceremonies and protocols served important purposes in maintaining military values and public trust. The meeting also provided an opportunity for both men to discuss the broader implications of what had occurred. They talked about the nature of military service in the modern world, the challenges of maintaining traditional values while adapting to contemporary realities, and the ways in which military personnel from different countries could support and learn from each other. Their conversation revealed that both men saw their military service as part of something larger than national defense, a commitment to values that transcended borders and created connections between people who might otherwise never encounter each other. James shared his own perspective on the reaction their story had generated, explaining that he had been surprised by the intensity of public interest, but gratified by the positive response from both military and civilian communities. He had received messages from active duty personnel, veterans, military families, and civilians from around the world, all expressing their appreciation for his actions and their support for the values his response had demonstrated. The feedback had reinforced his belief that military service, whether in combat or ceremonial roles, played an important role in maintaining social cohesion and shared values. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Patricia Whitmore, the commanding officer of James's regiment, who had requested the opportunity to meet Marcus personally. Colonel Whitmore's presence added an official dimension to the meeting, as she was there not just as James's superior officer, but as a representative of the British military establishment's response to the incident. Her participation in the meeting indicated that the story had reached the highest levels of military leadership and was being taken seriously as an example of military professionalism and international cooperation. Colonel Whitmore explained that the British military had been following the story with great interest and had concluded that James's actions represented exactly the kind of military judgment and human understanding that the service sought to develop in its personnel. Rather than viewing the incident as a protocol violation, military leaders saw it as an example of how traditional military values could be applied in unexpected situations to achieve outcomes that honored both military discipline and human dignity. The colonel also brought news that would transform Marcus's understanding of his journey and its significance. The British military, in coordination with American military leadership, was proposing to create a formal recognition of the incident and its meaning for military cooperation and shared values. The proposal included the establishment of an annual exchange program between British and American military units, with the program being named in honor of David Chen and the values his life had represented. The proposed David Chen Memorial Exchange would facilitate ongoing contact between British and American military personnel, creating opportunities for professional development, cultural exchange, and the kind of international military cooperation that David had admired in his studies of military traditions. The program would ensure that David's memory would continue to inspire future generations of military personnel, and that the values demonstrated during the ceremony at Buckingham Palace would have lasting institutional impact. Marcus was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being proposed, and by the idea that David's name would be associated with a program that embodied everything his friend had believed about military service and international cooperation. The Memorial Exchange would fulfill David's dream of connecting with military traditions from around the world in ways that even David himself could never have imagined. The program would also provide Marcus with a sense that his journey to London had achieved something far beyond the simple fulfillment of a promise to a dead friend. James's response to the proposed memorial program was equally emotional, as he realized that his instinctive response during the ceremony had contributed to creating something that would have lasting impact on military cooperation and training. The idea that his actions had helped inspire a program that would bring together military personnel from different countries to learn from each other and strengthen their shared commitments aligned perfectly with his own understanding of why military service mattered. The meeting concluded with concrete plans for moving forward with both the Memorial Exchange Program and ongoing contact between the various people who had been touched by the story. Dr. Singh would be invited to document the program's development for his research into military traditions and their contemporary relevance. Eleanor Hartwell would be asked to serve on the advisory committee that would guide the program's implementation, bringing her decades of community organizing experience to bear on the practical challenges of international military cooperation. Sarah Mitchell and her son Tommy would be invited to attend the program's inaugural ceremony, ensuring that civilian perspectives and the next generation would be included in the commemoration of David's memory. The American tourists who had witnessed the original ceremony would be contacted to participate in spreading awareness of the program through veterans organizations in the United States. Maria Gonzalez would be invited to serve as a liaison to Spanish military organizations, extending the program's reach beyond the original British-American framework. The expanded scope of the memorial program reflected the international nature of the response to Marcus and James's interaction. What had begun as a private act of remembrance by an American Marine had somehow grown into an international celebration of military values and cooperation. The program would ensure that David's admiration for military traditions and his belief in the importance of international understanding would continue to influence military personnel for years to come. As the meeting ended, and plans were made for future contact and coordination, Marcus reflected on how far he had come from the grieving, isolated Marine who had arrived in London just days earlier. The promise he had made to David had been fulfilled in ways that exceeded anything either friend could have imagined when they had first talked about traveling to see the changing of the guard. David's dream of witnessing the ceremony had indeed been realized, but more importantly, David's values and ideals had been validated and extended through the responses of people who had never met him, but who recognized the significance of what he had represented. The transformation of Marcus's private grief into a public celebration of military values had provided him with a new understanding of how individual acts of service and sacrifice could ripple outward to inspire others and create lasting change. David's death remained a tragedy that nothing could undo, but the response to Marcus's tribute had demonstrated that death could not diminish the power of values and ideals to continue influencing the world through the actions of those who had been touched by them. The journey that had begun with a promise between friends had evolved into something approaching a mission that would extend far beyond Marcus's original intentions. The Memorial Exchange Program would ensure that David's fascination with military traditions would continue to bring people together across cultural and national boundaries, creating exactly the kind of international understanding and cooperation that David had believed military service could foster. James Morrison's willingness to risk his own standing to honor a stranger's tribute had created opportunities for military cooperation and cultural exchange that would benefit future generations of service members. His actions had demonstrated that military discipline and human compassion were not competing values, but complementary aspects of service that could be maintained simultaneously even in challenging circumstances. The story had also revealed the capacity of ordinary people to recognize extraordinary moments and to respond with the kind of generosity and commitment that transformed individual experiences into shared celebrations of human values. Eleanor Hartwell, Dr. Singh, Sarah Mitchell, and all the others who had been touched by what they witnessed had chosen to invest their own time and energy in ensuring that the moment would have lasting significance beyond the immediate participants. As Marcus prepared to return to the United States, he carried with him not just the satisfaction of having fulfilled his promise to David, but also the knowledge that David's life and values had inspired a network of people who would continue working to honor his memory and extend his influence. The journey to London had begun as an ending, the final chapter in Marcus's relationship with his dead friend, but it had become a beginning, the first step in a larger story about how individual acts of service and recognition could create lasting connections between people and institutions across the world.